following this course before with Dr. Al-Hilal, and you've looked at a number of aspects of the English language, mostly the tenses. Today I want to talk to you about one of the most common mistakes that are done in the English language, and this is what is called the comma splice. The comma splice is a type of errors that is most common among learners of English, and it is most common in their writing. So today I want to explain to you what is the comma splice, and I want to give you some very basic methods to solve it, to deal with it, so that you don't have to make this type of mistakes. So, ala barakatillah. First of all, let us define a comma splice. What is a comma splice? A comma splice is basically a type of run-on sentence. We call them a run-on. It's a typical comma splice occurs when a writer joins together two independent clauses using only a comma as punctuation between them. So basically we have two independent clauses. Independent clauses. Does it sound strange? Have you heard what is an independent clause? Well, we'll explain it in a minute. So you have two independent clauses and we join them together with a comma, and in doing that, that's a mistake. So let's explain this a little further. What is an independent clause? And what is a dependent clause? There's two types of clauses. A clause can be independent if it is a sentence that can stand alone. If it stands alone, if it has a subject and a verb, like the sun shines brightly. The sun shines brightly. That's a full sentence. It's an independent clause, right? It can stand on its own. You can put a full stop at the end. This is a full sentence. It doesn't need anything else. It makes sense, it's grammatically correct, and it's an independent unit of sense. This is an independent clause. Now, what is a dependent clause? A dependent clause is a phrase that cannot stand alone. It is not capable of standing alone. You can't just put a full stop there and it becomes an independent unit of sense. It needs some extra to make sense. It is dependent upon another clause to form a complete sentence. It also has a subject and a verb. For example, the sun shining brightly. If we say the sun shining brightly, it's a fragment. It's not a full sentence. It's incomplete. It's an incomplete sentence, right? It has a subject, it has a verb, but the tense of the verb makes it a fragment. It's different when you say the sun shines brightly. The sun shines brightly. That's a full sentence. It doesn't need anything. But if you say the sun shining brightly and put a full stop there, that sentence doesn't make sense. It needs something else. There's something missing. You can say the sun is shining brightly, and that would make it a full sentence. That makes it an independent clause. But if we don't have is, right? If we don't have is, and we just have the sun shining brightly, that makes it a fragment. This sentence is not complete. So this is basically the difference between an independent clause and a dependent clause. A dependent clause cannot stand by itself. It needs something extra, an extra clause to make it a full sentence. But an independent clause is a sentence that's complete by itself. It doesn't need anything. I hope this is clear so far. So, what is a comma splice? A comma splice works with, it appears with dependent clauses, or sorry, with independent clauses. You have two independent clauses that are joined by a comma. Let's look at these four examples here and try to see which one of them uses the comma correctly and which one of them uses the comma the use of the comma in it is an error, it's a mistake. Sentence number one. Japanese cars are cheap. They have reliable engines. Japanese cars are cheap. They have reliable engines. Sentence number two. I love playing soccer. I hate playing tennis. Sentence number three. My uncle, comma, a businessman in his 50s, comma, lives in Cairo. Full stop. Number four. I watched a movie last night. It was boring. So, let's look at number one. Number one has two complete independent clauses. Japanese cars are cheap. That's an independent clause. It's complete. It's a full sentence. It doesn't need anything else. And the second part of the sentence, they have reliable engines. Again, that's an independent clause. It's complete. It doesn't need anything else. It's a complete sentence, right? And they are joined together by a comma, and that is an error, right? There is an error there. We'll explain why in a second. A comma splice, or commas in general, join dependent clauses together, right? It's like, if you want to think about an example, it's like, you know, having a car and your car breaks down. So you call for a tow company or a tow truck. You call the tow truck to tow your car because your car can't start. It doesn't work, right? So if your car is working fine, you don't need a tow truck. So it's the same thing for a comma. If you have two independent clauses, they're both of them independent, full sentences, you don't need to join them together. They can stand by themselves. So if you go back to sentence number one, Japanese cars are cheap, they have reliable engines, these two sentences do not need to be joined by a comma because they're separate units of sense. We can solve this by putting a full stop here and we put a big letter there. Japanese cars are cheap, full stop. Japanese cars are cheap, full stop. They have reliable engines, right? We have two separate sentences. They both make sense completely by themselves. You don't need a comma there. That comma there was unnecessary. That's what makes it a mistake. It's a mistake here because the comma was unnecessary. So, commas join dependent clauses together. But notice, they have to be dependent. They depend on each other. Like your car, when it's not working, depends on a tow truck. So you need a tow truck to pull it. If you have a dependent clause, it means it cannot start, it cannot work by itself. It needs to be connected to another clause, hence you use the comma, right? If a sentence is complete, if a clause is independent, it's complete, you do not need a comma. That's the basic rule. One way, very simple way to solve a comma splice is to use a full stop, right? A period. For example, like we did with sentence number 1, Japanese cars are cheap, they have reliable engines. Well, we just put a full stop there, a period, and the first letter becomes capital letter. Japanese cars are cheap, period. They have reliable engines, period. Two separate sentences. Each one is a complete sentence. Each one is correct. Each one makes full sense. They do not need to be joined together. The comma here is a comma splice. It's an error. It's a mistake. A second way of solving a comma splice, the problem of the comma splice, is to use what is called fanboys, coordinating conjunctions. They're coordinating conjunctions. They connect, right? They're connectors, basically, and they coordinate the conjunctions. We call them fanboys, right? Fanboys, because they include for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Right? These are connectors, coordinating conjunctions. Coordinating conjunctions. The name sounds technical, but they're very simple. They just connect, right, sentences. So, we look at sentence number 2. I love playing soccer. Right? Let's go back to sentence number 2. Here is sentence number 2. I love playing soccer, comma. I hate playing tennis. This is a comma splice. This is a mistake because you have two sentences. Are they dependent or independent? Well, this one has a subject, verb. I love playing soccer. It's a full sentence. It's an independent clause. Let's look at the second one. I hate playing tennis. Same thing. It's an independent clause. It makes sense fully by itself. It doesn't need anything, right? So we can use the first method like we did in the first sentence. We can put a full stop there and just say, I love playing tennis, period. I love playing soccer, period. I hate playing tennis. But it sounds a little repetitive, right? It sounds a little repetitive because the two sentences are connected in sense, right? I love playing soccer. I hate playing tennis. This is an example where you can use a coordinating conjunction to solve this comma splice. For example, you say, I love playing soccer, but I hate playing tennis. So you keep the comma there, and the comma becomes, it makes sense, it becomes, you solve the mistake by putting a coordinating junction. In this case, we're using but. I love playing soccer, but I hate playing tennis, right? Or you can say, it has to make sense. You can't just use any coordinating conjunction. I love playing soccer, and I hate playing tennis, right? If it makes sense, you can use and. So notice that in this instance the comma stays. The comma here stays, and we are just connecting these two independent clauses using a coordinating conjunction. And we've solved the comma splice problem in this instance. A third way of solving the comma splice is to use a semicolon. This is a semicolon. A semicolon is used when you have a sentence that has one idea and you want to add something to that idea within the same sentence, right? You have one idea in the sentence and you want to add something to it. For example, Japanese cars are cheap. They have reliable engines, right? So the second sentence here adds something to the first sentence. Japanese cars are cheap, right? They're cheap. I want to add to it that they have reliable engines. What do? I use a semicolon, right? A semicolon, you can think of it as a full stop, as a period. It functions as a period because the two sentences are full sentences. But you don't want to break them with a period because they're connected to each other, right? They're two sentences that add to each other. They're connected to each other. So instead of putting a period here, we put a semicolon to keep these two sentences connected to each other. So this is the second way of solving the comma splice. It's to use a semicolon. A third way, a third manner, a third way of solving the problem of the comma splice is to add a dependent clause to an independent clause, right? We add a dependent clause to an independent clause. So we have a sentence that's independent, it's complete by itself, and we add a dependent clause to it. For example, if we say Japanese cars are cheap, right? And we use one of these magical words. Because, since, when, or if. One of these. But it has to make sense. Japanese cars are cheap because they have reliable engines. Notice here, there is no punctuation, there is no period, there is no comma. The comma disappears, right? The comma disappears here. Japanese cars are cheap because they have reliable engines. Japanese cars are cheap and they have because they have reliable engines. You can use since, when, or if it makes sense, right? So you have these four. You can choose one of them, whichever one makes sense. And when it fits, you get rid of the comma, you get rid of any punctuation, and it becomes one sentence. It has an independent clause. Japanese cars are cheap. This is the independent clause. It's complete by itself. And you add to it a dependent clause. They have reliable engine. And you connect them using because. Japanese cars are cheap because they have reliable engines. So basically this is the problem of the comma splice. The comma splice is a case when you connect two sentences with a comma that don't need to be connected in that manner, right? That comma is wrong there. It doesn't need to be used there. Those two sentences can be put together in different ways. And we've seen a few ways of solving this problem of the comma splice. The first solution is to use a full stop, a period, right? You have two independent clauses. You don't need to have a comma between them. Your car is working fine. You don't need to tow it. It can work by itself. These two sentences are separate units of sense. They're independent. You don't need to join them by a comma. So you get rid of the comma, you put a period there, and you put a capital letter in the next sentence. That's the first way, that's the first solution to a comma splice. A second solution is to use one of the fanboys, which we described as for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. Right? So these, we call them fanboys. They are coordinating conjunctions. They're conjunctions that you use to coordinate the connection between one sentence and another. If these two sentences are connected in sense, and you think you can connect them using one of these, then use one of these and get rid of the period. Or you keep the comma, but it makes sense. I love playing soccer, comma, but I hate playing tennis. It makes sense. The third way, the third solution to a comma splice is to use a semicolon. When you use a semicolon, basically you have two sentences. They're full sentences. They're independent. Each one is a full sentence. But you don't put a period because you say these two sentences need to be joined. They're connected by sense. The sense, the meaning, connects these two sentences. So I don't want to break them with a full stop. What do? I use a semicolon. And although they are two full sentences, they are not broken. They stay together, and I join them using a semicolon. That's a third way of solving the problem of the comma splice. The fourth way of solving the problem of the comma splice is to use a dependent clause. You add a dependent clause to an independent clause, right? And you use one of those coordinating conjunctions, one of those coordinating words, because, since, when, and if, and you add an independent clause. Japanese cars are cheap because they have reliable engines. So these are the four ways of solving the comma splice. If we go back to our first examples, the four sentences we gave, we noticed that the first one was wrong, right? And we've solved it using a period, we solved it using a period. So this one is wrong, right? We solved it by putting a full stop here and by putting a title there, right? Let me do it properly. So we put full stop there and capital letter. Japanese cars are cheap, they have reliable engines. So now it is correct. The second sentence, I love playing soccer, I hate playing tennis, right? And we said we can use one of the fanboys here. We'll use but, right? We'll use I love playing soccer, but I hate playing tennis. Now, it is also correct. The third sentence, my uncle, comma, a businessman in his 50s, comma, lives in Cairo. Is this a comma splice? No, it's not. This is a correct use of the comma. It is organizing the sense in one sentence. My uncle lives in Cairo. That's the sentence. And we have this clause. We tucked it in there in the middle to organize the writing. So my uncle, comma, a businessman in his 50s, a businessman in his 50s lives in Cairo. This clause is connected to this clause. This isn't a dependent clause. My uncle, it just has a subject, right? My uncle. It's incomplete. It needs this clause to become a full sentence. My uncle lives in Cairo. And this independent clause, also a businessman in his 50s, it's incomplete by itself. It doesn't make sense. But we join them together using these commas, and we join them in a proper way so they make up a full, meaningful sentence. My uncle, a businessman in his 50s, lives in Cairo. This is not a comma splice. This is a correct use of the commas. And then the last sentence, I watched a movie last night. It was boring. I watched a movie last night. It was boring, right? Here, we can notice that it is a comma splice because this is an independent clause. I watched a movie last night. We have subject and verb. It's a full sentence. And here, we also have subject and verb, and it's a full sentence. It was boring, right? So these two sentences are independent clauses. They make sense by themselves. They do not need to be joined. And one way, that comma there is a comma splice because it's trying to join two sentences that in a bad way. It doesn't succeed in making that connection between these two sentences. One way of solving it here is to use a semicolon. I watched a movie last night. It was boring, right? So that means they're two sentences, they're complete sentences, and we don't want to break them with a full stop, so we use a semicolon instead, which means we are telling the reader these two sentences are complete, but they are connected by sense. So we don't want to break them with a period, with a full stop, and we're using a semicolon. And this gives you, it makes it correct now. So these are 4 ways that can help you solve the problem of the comma splice. I hope they are useful. I hope you can use these methods and get rid once and for all of the comma splices that you use in your writing and present sentences that are meaningful and connected together in an appropriate way that helps you express yourself. This brings us to the end of this class, and I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala wa barakatuh.